well, I said that. I also said, in fact, I said, who's the expert who testifies? And if the expert isn't there, and question the entire document. I told him that. In fact, he recorded about 2 hours, at least 2 hours, where I was going over, number one, how he should be questioning, and what he should be doing.
At the very top are people who are able to digest all of the theories of a particular discipline, in this case international law, and then know about a whole lot of other theories in other subject matters, and then to pick out a body of theory in another subject matter, and to say, I think that this theory in another subject matter could teach us a great deal about our own subject matter. And of course, this is where Anne-Marie Slaughter
Thank you. I guess you all know by now that I couldn't tell you what a will is if my life depended. Thank you, Mallory. That was a totally brilliant introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I have not been able to come to the International Law Association weekend for too long, which will be quickly remedied next year and the year after. But it's a great pleasure to come this year, particularly at this time. As Valerie already suggested, this is a time when many people, from reporters to students to policymakers, are discovering, in some cases rediscovering, but I hate to say it, I think in most cases discovering, that there is something called international law and that it is relevant. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with reporters where I say, well, let's start with the UN Charter and work forward from 1945 as rapidly as possible. I want to talk to you about our role collectively in the wake of September 11th. And I want to say that I think we are entering an international constitutional moment. For those of you who are familiar with constitutional law, and I would say the hierarchy is very similar, Bruce Ackerman at Yale has developed the idea of a constitutional moment in U.S. history. Great periods of change when there are fundamental shifts ratified, in his case, by the people. I would say we are entering an international constitutional moment, maybe more implicit than explicit, but it is up to all of us to help shape it. We can't help avoid the debate on a wide range of issues, everything from the UN Charter, the law of war, terrorist financing, hijacking conventions, humanitarian assistance, international tribunals, indeed many of the subjects that are being discussed on the panels this weekend and in many other fora over the past couple of months and coming months. Those issues are far too broad for me to even provide an overview. What I'd like to do is single out 3 particular areas that I think are focal points, and then I will come back to my overall theme of the role of international lawyers, and here I would say private and public. It doesn't seem to me at this time the distinction matters very much in helping shape those debates. So my 3 points. The first is the importance of what I see as a truly fundamental, overriding and underlying, although those two often don't go together, normative shift that the events of September 11th have helped to crystallize. They didn't create the shift, but they have crystallized it in a way that I think will now focus the world's attention. And that shift is the tremendous importance of a fundamental principle of not deliberately or an absolute prohibition on deliberately targeting or killing civilians for any purposes, whether by state or non-state actors. And I will come back to that. The second point that I want to cover, since it's particularly close to my own heart, is the focus on the focus on bringing terrorists to justice, but in a more concrete context, e.g., where are we going to bring them to justice? Where will we try them when we find them? This has been the subject of much debate, and indeed on one of the panels this morning, I'd like to offer a proposal and invite your debate. And the third point, in light of your introduction, you are going to laugh, is the interrelationship of law and politics. Not theory, actually, but certainly politics at a moment of crisis, and our role as international lawyers in addressing that point. So let me start with what I said was a fundamental shift, a sea change, I think, underlying the international legal system. In 1945, we came together, our forefathers and mothers, came together after half a century, indeed 3/4 of a century, of aggressive interstate war, and established the norm of non-use of force in interstate relations. That's obviously been imperfect. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter has often been violated. Nevertheless, 45 years after it was established, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that that was fundamentally illegitimate. That would not have been true before 1945, and in that sense, we had established a norm that was the framework within which all people, policymakers, diplomats, generals, and lawyers, thought about the legitimacy of what states could do to each other. Today, over the next 5 years, over the next decade, I have no particular crystal ball, but effectively, we will be amending the Charter, whether it's formally or informally, to enshrine a subsequent principle that is complementary to Article 2.4, but that now addresses violence against individuals rather than violence against states, or in addition to violence against states. It is a principle that is appropriate for the world that we live in, a world of state action, but also much action, much important action by non-state actors. And all of us have been bombarded with those changes, but we now need to take that into account at the heart of international law, the law of peace and security. So I suggest that the norm of no deliberate targeting or killing of civilians under any circumstances for any purpose by state or non-state actors accomplishes what Article 2.4 did for a world of interstate aggression. Non-targeting of civilians has been the core of the law of war. That's not surprising to anyone here. But we're going to make it the core of the law of peace. It must become a grundnorm of the international system. If you think about it even for a minute, it has enormous implications. It means that terrorists must be brought to justice, but that they will be tried worldwide and in every country for their means, not for their aims. It does not matter what political purpose you are fighting for if you are targeting civilians. This does not mean, I hasten to say, that we will have a ban on any effort of an insurgent group to fight a government when they don't have military forces. Targeting soldiers, even targeting police, while we may regret it, does not come under this norm. But targeting civilians is not acceptable. That means we'll be condemning non-state actors, but also governments. Governments who, in their efforts to quell domestic disturbance, even in civil war, who target civilians, unacceptable. That will also mean that we will have to be pressing governments far more within the framework of human rights law to provide more nonviolent means of resistance to those groups who now feel they cannot fight any other way. And that will be the law of that, the principles that have to govern the relations between states and those societies is going to be very important. It is a norm that is directly targeted at the weapons of mass destruction that we now face on a greatly heightened scale. Nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, none can be used without deliberately targeting civilians. Except possibly small nuclear weapons on a battlefield, but effectively, when we look at the threats we face, a norm of not targeting civilians is a ban on these kinds of weapons, but it will also mean the United States has to give up the doctrine of first use. It will mean that if we are to defend ourselves against these weapons through this kind of a norm, we will have to abide by it. So this is my first point, and it's one, whether you agree with this particular norm or not, I think we all, as international lawyers, have to be thinking at a very fundamental level, because the world has to respond to these threats, and it's not just September 11th, in the way the world responded in 1945. It's apparent from the way I make this point that we must do this collectively. No one nation, no group of nations can establish, proclaim such a norm alone, whatever the ultimate content is. That means we need to strengthen our regional and international institutions. We need to work through the United Nations. We are working through the United Nations far more than you might guess if you read the press. I don't know how many of you noticed that in the first week after September 11th, the United States paid its new UN dues. Immediately. Shortly thereafter, I wrote something arguing that we should go through the Security Council. I was told it was impossible. We were not even going to talk to the Security Council. Lo and behold, we did go to the Security Council. We did not ask them for authorization, but we did ask them for support, and the Security Council has issued 2 resolutions that have been astoundingly supportive. Shortly after that, the wisdom in Washington was, well, that's it for the UN, and lo and behold, the President announced that the UN had a very important role to play in nation building. Watch the progression. The next step will be, in fact, the UN has a very important role in helping bring these terrorists to justice. Which brings me to my second point. Where are we going to try any potential defendants, once we find them, once we prevail on other states to extradite them? And I'll say to begin with, I think nobody has the magic, here's what we will do with them. There will be many different fora. Some will certainly be tried in U.S. court. And of course, if we find our own nationals, as we are very likely to do, constitutionally they'll have to be tried in U.S. court. If we find non-nationals on U.S. soil, they are likely to be tried in U.S. court. European countries, the Germans, when they arrest those on their soil, Germans or visitors, will try them in Germany. That would be clearly one set of fora, national courts. It's also being proposed that we use a military tribunal. This is, I strongly disfavor this option. I will do no more than lay it out here, but that is also a possibility. I suggest that a third possibility must be some international tribunal. It will not be the only forum, but it must be an available forum. It must be because, as President Bush said, it is not just America's fight, it is the world's fight. We are fighting acts that are condemned under international law and under every legal system. Islamic law, Chinese law, Western law of various kinds. There is no legal system that permits what happened on September 11th and the things that we are still watching happen. We need an international tribunal to affirm that. But we also need an international tribunal for very practical reasons. Moderate Muslim states are not going to be able to extradite people they find to the United States or indeed to any European country. It will be politically impossible. Nor, in many cases, will they be able to try the people they find. You may have read that the Clinton administration had an agreement with Sudan to surrender Osama bin Laden. If Saudi Arabia would try him, the Saudi government couldn't take that risk. We will need an international tribunal, just as we have needed an international tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, to make it possible to achieve the political aims we profess. So for legitimacy reasons, for idealistic reasons, but also for very pragmatic reasons, we need an international tribunal. Some have suggested expanding the jurisdiction of the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Others, including myself, have suggested establishing an ad hoc tribunal for this purpose through the Security Council. Others have suggested accelerating the International Criminal Court. That last, I think, unless we get U.S. support, which is more optimistic than even I am willing to be, I don't think will work. But it doesn't matter what the details are. The general principle is something we must fight for. Talking about the need for an international tribunal, I think feeds into a larger point. I often find when I am asked to be on a panel or to do a radio show or a TV show, and called in as the local story-eyed idealist who will provide a good foil for the hard-headed realist. And I'm, if that's always accept and then try to prove them wrong. This is a time when we who understand international law as a repository for our collective ideals and aspirations also know full well that it is a very important political tool. It is one of the dimensions of international politics. It is an institution of world order that is absolutely necessary. And I think at a time when tremendous political questions are being posed, we owe it to the general public to make the political case as well as the strictly legal case. I'd like to quote here from an op-ed that was published by Robert Cohan, who's a very distinguished political scientist, who in fact had his original roots in realism and then moved from realism to institutionalism in the jargon of IR theory. But he published an op-ed in the North Carolina, in the Durham newspaper, and he was writing about coalition building. And he said, we should draw a lesson from these events. Global international organizations are potentially valuable in crises. It is fair of us to criticize their shortcomings, but myopic to withhold financial and political support from these institutions because we are irritated at criticisms of U.S. policy. On the contrary, during peaceful and prosperous periods, we should seek to expand the capacity of international organizations such as the United Nations, so that in difficult times we can call upon them for support, such as the Security Council has shown during the past 3 weeks. To many of us, at least at first glance, that might seem like a distressingly instrumental view. We ought to have the United Nations because they can provide support when we need them. But in fact, international law and institutions serve interests as well as ideals for all nations, not just powerful ones. As international lawyers, we don't have all the answers, and we would do the public a disservice if we pretended that we did. But we can make the case for multilateral cooperation, for establishing and achieving international rules to achieve political ends in the short and the long run. We have an unprecedented chance to make that case and to help shape a renewed effort at establishing international order under law. It's the chance of a century, and we have to take it. Thank you.
Professor Sullivan has said she will be happy to take questions from almost everybody.
In midterms at Fletcher, the midterm for the basic international law course said, suppose Pakistan catches an al-Qaeda person, what do they do with it? My students have read the Lotus case. They know the bases for jurisdiction to prescribe. They also know the distinction between jurisdiction to prescribe, jurisdiction to enforce, jurisdiction to adjudicate. The question that I would like to ask then is, suppose Pakistan catches an al-Qaeda member, are we going to revive common law crimes? This is, I guess, Ben Farron's would say that this is not common law crimes, but what is the legislation, what is the criminal act that has been violated? Bearing in mind that under U.S. federal law, common law crimes were abolished in 1816 when the executive branch refused to bring any more criminal law allegations. Joseph Story objected to that, and there was an exception made for piracy, but it didn't work. And when Joseph Story died, after he died, there had been absolutely no convictions for piracy in the United States outside of the Civil War context, when pirates were convicted of piracy and then sent to prisoner of war holding camps and released at the end of active hostilities. Therefore, I'm curious, what has Al-Qaeda actually done that violates whose criminal law, and why are you proposing then an international tribunal now to try them with exactly what?
Can I ask Ben Ferencz to answer the question? You can ask your question next. Well, honestly, Al, the first question I'd ask is, well, there would be two responses. One, I'd like to know more about the law of Pakistan. I'd be surprised if conspiracy for mass murder were not a violation of the law of Pakistan in some way.
Conspiracy to commit a mass murder in the United States?
Well, so I would suggest it's, and I don't know the terms of our extradition treaty, but I would suggest it's a crime under both countries. And under international law, I don't think there's any doubt that it would be conspiracy to commit a crime against humanity. Now, I grant you that that's exactly what the Bosnia Tribunal in many ways is elaborating, the commission of a crime. They're then, of course, moving to the next step. But it doesn't seem to me a very far stretch to think under international law this was prohibited and you could be held to know it. Ireland. It's no accident that notwithstanding the hideous complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that for the very first time Yasser Arafat arrested and indeed shot at his own people, recognizing that there had to be some limits. So I think the world is very ready for reevaluating that. And note, I think we need to move away from the idea of terrorist. Sowing terror is an aim. My proposition is I don't care what your aim is. I don't care if you call it sowing terror, and I don't care if you call it freedom fighting. I care about the means. So to move it away from this idea that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, we say there's an absolute ban. On the second proposition, I'm working hard to get the U.S. government to at least return my phone calls. But honestly, I think you're right that the proposition has been we're going to try them in U.S. court. I think there's a great amount of concern about the security considerations, but more than that, the intelligence revealing problems, and the idea, as one person put it to me, just imagine the dream team of defense lawyers that Osama bin Laden could convene. Let's just imagine 2 years of grandstanding and propaganda, and after that, we finally get a verdict. So I think there's a lot of concern about that, and therefore we're investigating a military tribunal that would be secret. I honestly think that is winning the battle and losing the war. I cannot imagine anything worse for the world at large than to say we treated him as a soldier and we tried him in secret without the benefit of due process, which we supposedly stand for. So to that extent, I think they're going in a worse direction. I think there will be an argument, again, not for everyone, but that in fact an international tribunal could solve a lot of problems, and I at least think they might be willing to entertain the case, but I'm not. It's a long fight. I'm willing to start engaging it. Jim.
Henry, I have a question that turns out relates to John's, at least the first part of it. And that is this, you're a pioneer in the theory of liberalism that takes account of networking that may or may not include state actors.
Yes.
That in fact takes account of the growing civil society and so on. In this very difficult situation we have now, we have a significant portion of humankind that not only rejects a system of international law that we are so committed to, but in fact goes beyond that to replace it with a normative system based upon the idea of oppression and the idea of a jihad or jihad and so on, responds to that. Isn't that a very different situation than even the Nuremberg situation, where after all the actors, even if they were Japanese and certainly if they were German in the Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes process, nevertheless hadn't constructed a system such as we're hearing about now that actually replaces our Western imagination, and that's the way it's viewed as simply a product of Western imagination imperialism. Doesn't that change our confidence in constructing new principles such as the gun norm that certainly most of us would otherwise agree with?
Great question. In part, my response is that I'm certainly no Islamic law specialist. The Islamic lawyers that I've consulted and reading the press, reading sort of slightly more academic press, we haven't had a chance to have the raft of articles we will have, suggest to me that that is one view in Islam, but it's only one view, and that there are many, many, many interpretations, and indeed most of the authoritative interpreters have condemned the September 11th attacks, that say, yes, we get there a different way, but we equally condemn this kind of attack, and that you can cite the Quran as easily in opposition to this as you could reading it extremely for it. But I think there's a deeper issue there, which is to the extent there is support for the view you mentioned, and there's no question there is such support. The best guess we have as policymakers, as political scientists, is that that is born out of very distorted relations between governments and individuals, of the oppression that we are often seen as backing. And my response is actually consistent with the Grundnorm and consistent with the brand of liberalism I hold, which is to say that it is the role of international law, a role, not the only role, an important role to focus on the relationship between governments and their societies. We do that in the area of human rights. We have done that primarily in the area of physical harms. We are probably, if we are going to impose this kind of duties on individuals, we will probably have to focus much more on the duties of governments toward those individuals. And in that, when we're talking about a set of norms that apply to the way governments treat their citizens, the way individual government officials are held responsible for acts of war, and now how individual non-state actors are held responsible for what they do to states or to other individuals, we're going to have to elaborate a set of rules that govern government relations toward their individuals as well as the reverse. That's a very long-term project, but I don't see anything in what I know of Islam that does suggest that that is a universal project.
Well, I said that. I also said, in fact, I said, who's the expert who said this on?